Hello guys. Tonight, I want to take you into a story that drifts slowly, like smoke curling into the night sky. A story about thunder, silence, and the strange rhythm of life as an artilleryman during the First World War. You might already know that artillery was called the god of war, not because it was divine, but because its voice could change the fate of entire battles. Yet behind every massive gun, every shell that whistled into the sky, there were men. Ordinary men. They sweated, they feared, they joked, they wrote letters, and they carried burdens heavier than the shells they lifted. And through their eyes, through the voice of one of them, we will walk together tonight. Before we begin properly, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? I find it fascinating to imagine this story drifting across miles and hours, reaching you wherever you might be. Perhaps in the quiet of your bedroom, perhaps while the night rain taps softly on your window. Now, let us step back in time to a world that feels impossibly distant, and yet was just over a century ago. Our story begins not with a battle, but with a boy. His name was Thomas Bennett. He was born in the rolling fields of Kent in southern England, where the air smelled of cut hay in summer, and the village bells rang every Sunday without fail. His father was a farmer, a man who measured life by harvests and weather, and his mother kept the home warm with bread, soup, and stories by the fire. Thomas's world was small but steady. He knew the paths between hedgerows, the church with its crooked steeple, the laughter of children playing in the lanes. In those days, artillery was just a word he might have read in a newspaper headline. Cannons belonged to history books, not to his life. But when war came in 1914, it seemed to sweep across Europe like a storm, uprooting even the quiet corners of Kent. Posters appeared in the towns, painted in bold colors. "Your country needs you." The names of neighbors and cousins began to vanish from the village, replaced by hurried farewells at the train station. Thomas was 19 when he volunteered. Too young, his mother said. Old enough, his father insisted, with a grave nod that Thomas never forgot. And so, with a suitcase that smelled of home, a pocket Bible, and a nervous smile, he set off to join the Royal Field Artillery. He did not know what to expect. He imagined horses pulling guns across green meadows, sharp uniforms, and the glory spoken of in recruiting speeches. What he did not imagine was mud so deep it could swallow boots whole, or nights where the thunder of cannons shook the ground until it felt like the earth itself might crack. Training was the first step. The army taught him to march in endless squares of men, to polish brass until it shone like the sun, and to shout "Yes, sir" until his voice rasped. But most of all, they taught him about the guns. Enormous, iron beasts with wheels taller than a man, their barrels black with oil, their weight needing horses to drag them across fields. He learned how to load a shell, its casing gleaming and heavy, how to adjust the sights, and how to work with speed and precision. The first time Thomas stood beside one as it fired, he felt the shock run through his bones. The sound was not just heard. It lived inside his chest, rattling his ribs, making his ears ring for minutes after. It was terrifying, and yet, in a strange way, thrilling. He was no longer a boy from a farm. He was part of the artillery. Evenings in camp were quieter. Soldiers sat around fires, mugs of tea in their hands, swapping stories about sweethearts, towns, and rumors. One man claimed the war would be over by Christmas. Another swore it might last years. Some laughed. Others stared silently into the flames. Thomas wrote letters home in careful handwriting, telling his mother not to worry, that he was safe, that the food was fine, and that the men were good company. He left out the blisters, the exhaustion, the sudden moments of doubt. The days blurred together, each one carrying him closer to departure. When the orders finally came to move, Excitement and fear mingled like smoke and air. They boarded trains, long, rumbling lines of steam and coal, carrying them away from the countryside they knew and toward the unknown fields of France. As Thomas looked out of the window at the fading hills of Kent, he wondered when he might see them again, or if he ever would. The whistle blew, the train jolted forward, and the journey into the storm of war began. The train rattled on through the night, carrying Thomas and hundreds of others toward the coast. Sleep was nearly impossible. The wooden benches were hard. The air was filled with the mingled smells of oil, damp wool, and tobacco smoke. Some men tried to rest, their heads bumping against the windows with each lurch of the carriage, while others spoke in hushed voices, trying to mask the unease creeping into their thoughts. The rhythm of the wheels on the track became like a drumbeat, steady and relentless, as though echoing the march of thousands of other soldiers being ferried toward the front. When the train slowed and finally hissed to a halt, it was dawn. They had arrived at the port of Southampton, where rows of ships stood waiting like silent beasts of iron. The men were herded off the train, their boots striking cobblestones slick with sea mist. For many, this was their first glimpse of the sea, vast and gray under the early light. The channel crossing was not glamorous. It was crowded, rough, and reeked of coal smoke. But as the ship pulled away, Thomas leaned on the rail and looked back at the fading shore of England. The cliffs were pale against the horizon, almost ghostly, and he thought of home, of the fields where the harvest must already be gathered. He wondered how long it would be before he saw that familiar coast again. The voyage was short but uneasy. The sea tossed the ship, and many men turned pale, leaning over the sides as waves slapped against the hull. Officers barked orders to keep formation even in the cramped decks, reminding the men that German submarines lurked beneath these waters. The tension was sharp, but luck was with them. Hours later, the French coastline came into view, dotted with fishing boats and the dark smudge of ruined buildings left from earlier bombardments. Stepping onto French soil was both strange and sobering. The air carried the scent of foreign earth, mingled with smoke and salt. The port town was crowded with soldiers from across the empire. Men from Scotland with sharp accents, Australians with broad grins, and Canadians, their voices confident and clear. Horses stamped restlessly as artillery wagons rolled down the docks, the clatter of wheels echoing against stone walls. For Thomas, it was overwhelming. The war was no longer an idea, no longer something distant. It was everywhere, written in the scars of buildings, in the weary faces of villagers, and in the endless movement of troops. From the port, they boarded trains again, this time French carriages, smaller, older, and far more crowded. Painted on the side of each was a simple phrase: 40 hommes, 8 chevaux, 40 men or 8 horses. The soldiers laughed grimly at the words, cramming into the tight spaces with their rifles, packs, and weary bodies. The train clattered through the French countryside, past vineyards stripped bare, past villages where shutters hung broken, past fields that once carried wheat but were now churned into mud. From time to time, children waved from the roadsides, their eyes curious and wide, while their mothers pulled them back, casting cautious glances at the endless line of soldiers rushing east. The further they traveled, the heavier the air became. At first, the land looked peaceful enough, rolling hills and scattered farms. But mile by mile, the signs of war grew clearer. Trees stood shattered, their branches torn away. Farmhouses were abandoned, their roofs caved in. Horses pulling wagons looked thin, their ribs showing beneath worn hides. And then, faintly at first, Thomas began to hear it, the distant thunder of guns. Not one, not two, but dozens, their voices overlapping until it became a continuous hum on the horizon. That sound marked the edge of another world, By the time the train slowed near their destination, the men were silent, their earlier chatter drained away. They unloaded quickly, struggling under the weight of packs and ammunition boxes, and marched down roads that grew muddier with every step. The air was damp, carrying a sour smell Thomas did not at first recognize. Only later would he learn it was the smell of earth churned with cordite, blood, and decay. The closer they came, the stranger everything looked. Villages were not villages anymore, they were skeletons. Walls riddled with holes, chimneys standing alone like gravestones, windows shattered. Churches had their steeples blown away, bells silenced. Horses pulled the great guns forward, their hooves slipping in mud that seemed to have no bottom. Soldiers trudged alongside them, shoulders bent, their uniforms already stained with grime. By the time Thomas reached his first encampment near the front, night was falling. Fires flickered in dugouts carved from the earth, their entrances supported with wooden beams. The ground shook at intervals, each tremor a reminder that the guns were never far away. As he dropped his pack onto the wet ground, Thomas felt exhaustion pull at every limb. And yet, beneath the fatigue, his heart beat with a nervous energy. This was it, the war he had heard about in speeches and songs, now close enough to feel in the soil beneath his boots. He sat on a wooden crate, looking into the dark horizon where flashes lit the sky like distant storms. Men spoke in low voices around him, some joking to hide their nerves, others whispering prayers. One soldier lit a cigarette and muttered, "That's the sound you'll dream about, mate. It gets into your bones." Thomas listened. The thunder of the guns rolled endlessly, a sound that seemed to stretch beyond time itself. He wondered what awaited him when the sun rose. Would he fire his first shells? Would he see the enemy, or only the results of his own aim? And most of all, he wondered, how long could any man live in a world that sounded like this? The night deepened, the guns continued, and Thomas, sitting on that crate, felt as though he had stepped into another life entirely, a life from which there might be no easy return. Morning came not with birdsong, but with the groaning of wagons, the stamping of hooves, and the hollow cough of distant guns. Thomas had slept little his first night near the front, the earth itself trembling every time the batteries roared somewhere beyond the trees. When he climbed out of the damp dugout where he had rested, his boots sank instantly into mud. It clung to him like glue, sucking at his heels with every step. Above, the sky was pale and heavy with low clouds, the kind that seemed to press down on the earth as though weighing it further into misery. He was led with his unit to the gun positions. They were hidden in shallow pits, camouflaged with branches, torn canvas, and netting. The great field guns rested there like beasts at rest, their barrels angled toward the horizon, dark mouths waiting to be fed. Around them lay crates of shells, thick cylinders of steel, painted and stenciled with codes, their brass casings gleaming faintly under the weak light. The smell of oil, cordite, and wet earth mingled into something sharp that Thomas would never forget. The work began quickly. Artillerymen did not spend their days lounging in trenches with rifles. Their life was a cycle of preparation, labor, and sudden bursts of thunder. The sergeant barked orders, his voice hoarse but commanding. Thomas and the others set to lifting shells, passing them along in chains of sweating men, stacking them carefully like deadly firewood. Each shell was heavy, over 80 pounds for some, and before long his arms ached, his back strained, and his uniform clung damply to his skin. He thought of the farm at home, of hauling sacks of grain, of lifting hay bales. The work was familiar in shape but not in weight. Every shell was not food, not harvest. It was destruction, waiting to be unleashed. When the first fire order came, Thomas watched closely. The gun crew worked with clockwork precision, each man knowing his role. One set the fuse, another loaded the shell, another adjusted the elevation by turning heavy wheels, and then, signal given, the lanyard was pulled. The gun thundered, leaping backward with a recoil that shook the earth. Smoke belched out, acrid and choking, filling noses and throats with bitterness. The sound was not a sound at all. It was a force, a physical wave that rolled through the chest and left ears ringing. Thomas felt it differently now than in training. This was not an exercise in an open field back home. This shell was aimed at somewhere real, at a trench line, a road, a cluster of men he would never see. The thought struck him cold. The infantry called artillerymen the big killers, and he now began to understand why. Their enemy was faceless, distant, hidden by miles. They were not shooting at soldiers, not directly, but at maps, coordinates, and angles. And yet, the result was the same. The routine grew clearer as hours passed. Work, wait, clean, work again. The guns fired in bursts, then fell silent, then roared again when a new order came down the line. Between barges, the men sat in their dugouts, sharing biscuits gone soft from damp air, or heating tins of bully beef over small stoves that smoked more than they burned. Rats skittered along the walls, fat from feeding on scraps, bold enough to dart across a man's boots without fear. Some soldiers cursed them, others laughed, saying the rats were better fed than the men themselves. The dugouts were not homes, but holes, earth reinforced with planks, dripping with moisture, smelling of mold and sweat. Candlelight flickered in the dark, casting long shadows on the muddy walls. At night, men wrote letters with cramped fingers, their hands shaking slightly from the constant vibration of distant shells. Thomas found himself writing again and again, though there was little to say. He told his mother he was healthy, told his father the horses were strong, told his younger sister that France had fine bread. He did not tell them of the lice in his seams, of the taste of smoke that never left his tongue, of the way the ground seemed to breathe beneath him with every distant detonation. Sometimes, when the guns were silent, an eerie quiet settled. In those moments, Thomas could hear the faint cries from the front lines, carried on the wind. It was not always screams, sometimes just the clatter of tools, the shouts of commands, the distant rattle of rifles. But once, late at night, as he stood on duty near the gun pit, he thought he heard singing. Faint, almost drowned by the wind, but real. A hymn, or perhaps a folk song, drifting from somewhere in the darkness where the infantry lay in their trenches. It lasted only a few moments, cut short by a sudden roar of artillery down the line, but Thomas never forgot it. The older men in his battery told him he would grow used to it. After a while, one said, "The guns are just weather. You don't hear them, not really. You just live inside the thunder." Thomas was not sure if that was true. To him, every barrage still felt like the end of the world, and every silence felt like a trap waiting to break. By the end of that first week, his uniform was already torn at the knees, his boots caked beyond recognition. His hands were blistered, his shoulders sore. But when he looked at the others, faces gaunt, eyes rimmed with red, yet still able to laugh at a crude joke or hum a tune, he realized he was becoming one of them. The farm boy from Kent was fading, replaced by something harder, shaped by mud and steel and fire. And as another day closed, the sky flashing orange on the horizon with distant gunfire, Thomas lay in the dugout, staring upward at the beams above his head. He wondered how many nights like this lay ahead. The war was only beginning, and already it felt endless. The longer Thomas remained at the front, the more he began to realize that life as an artilleryman was measured not by clocks, nor by sunrises and sunsets, but by sound. The guns were the heartbeat of their existence, and that heartbeat never truly stopped. At first, every detonation seemed like an event, a violent shock that demanded attention. His chest rattled with each recoil. His teeth clinked against one another with every blast. But as days passed, the sounds layered upon each other until they became a kind of distorted music, a symphony of thunder that stretched across miles. There were deep booms of heavy howitzers, sharp cracks of smaller field pieces, the long rumble of a rolling barrage, and always, somewhere beyond, the faint reply of German guns, answering like an echo from the far horizon. What struck Thomas most was the way the sound carried into the body. It wasn't just noise, it was pressure. When a nearby gun fired, it was as if an invisible hand shoved against his chest. The ground shook beneath his boots, dust and pebbles rattling in dugouts, mugs toppling over, candles flickering out. Even when he pressed his hands hard against his ears, the force was still there, rolling through bones and stomach and lungs. Some men grew numb to it, or at least claimed they did. They joked that the guns were like an unfaithful wife, loud, demanding, impossible to ignore, but something you eventually learned to live with. Others showed the strain. One soldier flinched every time a lanyard was pulled, his body jerking as though struck. Another muttered constantly under his breath, lips moving in rhythm with the barrages, as if trying to count them like beads on a rosary. Sleep was shallow, broken by sudden salvos that jolted men awake, hearts racing. The phrase shell shock had not yet become common, but its effects were already written across many faces. Thomas tried to steady himself by studying the sounds, almost as if they were part of the landscape. He learned to distinguish distance by ear, the near crash of his own battery, the mid-range roar of neighboring guns, the far-off thump of enemy fire. Sometimes he could even tell when a shell was incoming, hearing the thin whistle that began high above and ended in a shattering crack. That whistle was unlike anything else, a thread of fear drawn tight in the air, snapping only when the earth erupted in smoke and soil. The nights were the hardest. In daylight, the world was visible and the chaos at least had shape. At night, darkness swallowed everything, leaving only flashes. Each burst lit the horizon with white fire, silhouettes of broken trees and shattered villages leaping into view before being swallowed again. The air seemed alive, trembling with constant vibrations. Thomas often lay awake, staring upward at the timbers of the dugout roof, listening to the rolling percussion. His mind drifted between thoughts of home and the strange realization that silence no longer felt natural. On rare occasions, silence did come. Not true silence, never that, but long pauses, stretches where the guns rested. Those moments unsettled him most. The absence of thunder left the air hollow, as if waiting for something to break. Men whispered more during those pauses, their voices oddly loud without the camouflage of noise. Some claimed they could hear things in the quiet, phantom footsteps, whispers in the earth, the cries of men long buried beneath the mud. One evening, after a day of heavy firing, Thomas stood near the edge of their position, watching smoke drift across the fields. The horizon glowed faintly, like a dying fire smoldering in the distance. He noticed how the very earth seemed scarred, craters overlapping like pockmarks, trees snapped into jagged spears. And then another sound joined the landscape, the faint toll of a church bell. Somehow, in a ruined village miles away, a bell still hung in its tower, ringing with each vibration of distant guns. The sound was ghostly, a reminder of a world that once had peace and order. The veterans told stories about the sounds. One claimed that after months at the front, even when he was sent home on leave, he still heard the echoes. "It gets inside you," the man said, tapping his skull. "The thunder follows you everywhere." Another swore that the enemy guns had voices, that if you listened long enough, you could hear them speaking, calling, mocking. The younger men laughed at such talk, but when the nights grew long and the barges rolled endlessly, Thomas sometimes wondered if there wasn't a truth hidden in the madness. He found himself humming, at times, beneath the roar, old tunes from the farm, hymns from church. The rhythm was drowned by the guns, but it gave him something steady to hold on to, something that belonged to him and not to the war. Once, a fellow gunner noticed and joined in, humming along, their quiet song threading through the chaos like a fragile string of humanity. In the weeks that followed, Thomas's hearing dulled. High-pitched sounds slipped away from him. Birds, insects, even some voices became harder to catch. He noticed it most when he tried to recall the gentle noises of home. The wind rattling leaves, the creak of barn doors, the lowing of cattle in the evening. Those memories now seemed strangely muted, drowned out by the constant echo of artillery. And yet, despite everything, he carried on. Each day began with thunder, ended with thunder, and his body slowly bent itself to the rhythm. The sound was no longer only terror. It was identity, proof that he was part of something vast and terrible, a machine that stretched across fields and nations. As he lay down one night, the ground still quaking beneath him, Thomas thought, perhaps this is what the war truly is. Not the rifles, not the charges, not the flags or speeches, but sound. A world reshaped by thunder. And he, like all the others, was destined to live inside it until the war decided otherwise. The days on the Western Front blurred into one another, and for Thomas, time itself seemed to lose its meaning. Morning and evening were almost indistinguishable when the sun was hidden behind thick layers of smoke, fog, and drifting artillery dust. Sometimes he wondered if the war had always been there, before he was even born, and if he would ever remember what it felt like to wake up to silence. The battery's guns had become his constant companions, their iron forms looming like ancient guardians. They were reliable in their terrible way, but also merciless. When he first joined the artillery, Thomas had thought mostly about the thrill of firing, of controlling a machine so powerful that it could tear through walls and shatter enemy formations. But now, months into the grind, he saw the other side. Being an artilleryman was not just about destruction, it was about precision, about responsibility. Every shell he loaded carried weight, not only in iron and powder but in consequence. If the aim was wrong, if the coordinates were miscalculated by even a small margin, innocent villages could be destroyed, or friendly infantry could be caught in the blast. The pressure was relentless. Life in the dugouts was rough and raw. The artillerymen lived half-buried in the earth, in wooden shelters reinforced with sandbags, their ceilings dripping with condensation. Rats scurried freely in the shadows, bold enough to gnaw on soldiers' boots or nibble crumbs from their meager rations. Lice were everywhere, crawling under uniforms, biting in the middle of the night until men scratched themselves bloody. And yet, in some strange way, the battery became a family. They shared food, cigarettes, and dark jokes. Thomas often thought it was only humor that kept men from losing their minds completely. At night, when firing slowed, he sometimes lay awake listening to distant cries or the eerie rumble of tanks and trucks moving behind enemy lines. Stories passed quickly through the ranks, tales of German big guns, monstrous railway artillery pieces that could fire shells across incredible distances. The men whispered about them with a mix of awe and dread, calling them by names like Big Bertha. To the infantry, artillery fire was terror from the unseen. But to artillerymen like Thomas, those German giants were rivals, enemies in a duel that stretched across miles of broken earth. And yet, there were quieter moments too. One evening, during a lull in firing, Thomas found himself staring at the horizon. The setting sun spilled a strange, crimson glow over the battlefield, its colors blending with the smoke to create a sky that looked both beautiful and terrifying. It reminded him of autumn evenings at home, when the fields turned golden and the air grew cool. For just a moment, he allowed himself to imagine walking through those fields again, his younger brother running ahead of him, his mother calling them back for supper. Then, the thunder of a distant shell pulled him back, as if the war refused to let him escape even in thought. The guns demanded constant work. Each round weighed nearly 100 pounds, and lifting them again and again wore men down. Their shoulders ached, their hands blistered, their backs screamed in protest. And yet, there was never enough rest. When orders came to fire, no matter the hour, men scrambled into position. Some nights they were woken from shallow sleep and told to keep the barrage going for hours without pause, hammering the enemy trenches until the earth shook like thunder. But Thomas noticed something strange about the war. The longer it went on, the more surreal it seemed. There were moments when the violence felt unreal, like a dream or a nightmare that he could not wake from. Once, while preparing to fire, he caught himself staring at a single wildflower growing near the gun, its petals trembling from the shockwaves. It was such a fragile, tiny thing, surviving in the middle of so much chaos. He crouched near it for just a second, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he whispered a quick apology before returning to his duty. The men often spoke in hushed tones about the infantry. They pitied them. While the artillery worked behind the lines, the infantry had to climb over the top and charge into machine gun fire, often across mud so deep that boots were swallowed whole. When barrages ended and silence fell, the artillerymen knew that men out there were advancing, fighting, and dying. Thomas wondered sometimes if those infantrymen ever thought kindly of the artillery, or if they cursed them for mistakes and misfires. Sleep was broken, fragmented by sudden orders or the crash of enemy shells. Dreams, when they came, were strange and unsettling. Thomas often dreamed of home, but always with some distortion. His mother's face would blur, his father's voice would sound distant, or his brother's laughter would fade into the echo of artillery fire. Once, he dreamed he was back in the village, sitting at the dinner table. But when he looked out the window, the fields beyond were filled with barbed wire and craters. And yet, through all of this, there was a strange rhythm to life as an artilleryman. The constant routine, cleaning the gun, carrying shells, double-checking fuses, firing, waiting, became almost hypnotic. It dulled the sharpness of fear, but every so often reality struck hard. A shell could land close, collapsing part of the dugout. A man could vanish in an instant, leaving only fragments behind. One morning, Thomas heard that another battery nearby had been targeted by German counterfire. They said an entire crew had been buried alive when their dugout collapsed. Thomas stood silent after hearing it, staring down at his mud-caked boots. He didn't know the men, but he felt the loss like a chill in his bones. It was a reminder that artillerymen were not safe, not truly. Death could find them as easily as anyone else. And still, the war dragged on. Days folded into weeks, weeks into months. The guns roared, the ground shook, and the men carried on, because what else could they do? The war had a way of stealing seasons. When Thomas first arrived at the front, it was late summer. The fields were still green, the air warm, and though the ground was scarred with shell holes, there was life clinging to the edges. Now, months later, the bitter chill of winter was setting in. Cold seeped into every crack and corner of the dugouts, into the joints of the men, into the very barrels of the guns. The mud, once thick and heavy, froze into jagged ridges that cut at their boots. Frost coated the earth, glistening like a cruel disguise over the ruined landscape. For artillerymen, winter brought new challenges. The guns themselves suffered. Metal shrank in the cold, bolts stiffened, and firing mechanisms sometimes froze solid. The men had to keep moving, keep rubbing their hands, keep oiling every part of the machine to make sure it would still roar to life when ordered. Ammunition was harder to handle as well. Shells became slick with frost, and fingers numbed quickly as they lifted them. Thomas remembered one night when he could barely feel his hands but still had to help load. By the end, his fingertips were bleeding from cracks in the skin, yet he hardly noticed until the work was over. Food was never plentiful, but winter made it worse. Rations often arrived late, frozen solid or spoiled from the journey through the mud. Bread became as hard as stone. Fatty pork was sometimes all they had, and it carried a taste of rot that no amount of chewing could hide. Many of the men joked that the rats ate better than they did, and judging by the size of some of the rodents, Thomas thought they might be right. Still, hunger dulled the disgust. They ate whatever came. There were moments when the cold brought unexpected stillness. Snow muffled the sound of distant gunfire, blanketing the landscape with a deceptive quiet. The battlefield almost looked peaceful, its torn earth softened by white. But beneath that thin cover lay corpses, wreckage, and the ever-present reminder that no beauty lasted here. One evening, as Thomas stood outside the dugout, flakes drifted gently onto his coat. For a fleeting moment, he thought of Christmas at home, of candles flickering in the windows and the church bells ringing. He wondered if the bells still rang in his village, or if the war had silenced them too. The men of the battery tried to keep spirits alive through small rituals. One soldier carved tiny figures from scraps of wood. Another collected shell casings and polished them into crude cups. Cigarettes became precious currency, traded for favors, shared as a gesture of friendship. Thomas himself began keeping a small notebook, jotting down thoughts when he could. He wasn't sure why, maybe to remember, maybe just to give order to the chaos. His handwriting grew shaky from the cold, but the words were there, hidden in his coat pocket like a secret. At night, stories filled the silence when the guns quieted. The men spoke of home, of farms and factories, of mothers and sweethearts waiting far away. But they also told darker tales, rumors of new German weapons, of poison gas drifting across no man's land, of entire companies wiped out in a single morning. One man claimed he had seen soldiers who went mad from the constant shelling, running into the open screaming until machine guns cut them down. The others fell silent at that story, for they all knew it could happen to anyone. The relationship between the artillery and the infantry grew more apparent as winter dragged on. Thomas often watched columns of weary men trudging past, their uniforms tattered, their faces hollow from exhaustion. He knew that when his battery unleashed a barrage, those men were the ones who had to climb over the top afterward. They would charge forward into the wasteland that the guns created, trying to survive in a storm of bullets and shrapnel. Sometimes, infantrymen would pass by and nod in gratitude. Other times, their eyes held something colder, something accusing. Perhaps they blamed the artillery when the barrages fell short, or when the promised breakthroughs never came. Thomas once overheard an infantry officer mutter that artillerymen had it easy, that they sat behind the lines safe while others bled in the mud. Thomas said nothing, but the words stung. He wanted to tell the officer about the counter-barrages, about how one shell could bury a dugout alive, about the constant weight of knowing that a single mistake might kill their own comrades. But he stayed quiet. In war, suffering was everywhere, and comparisons brought no comfort. As the weeks wore on, sickness spread through the ranks. The cold and damp bred coughs, fevers, and chills. Men huddled under blankets that were never truly warm, their bodies shivering, their faces pale. Medical supplies were scarce, and those who grew too sick were often left behind until transport could be arranged. Thomas himself fell ill one week, his body racked with coughing fits that left him doubled over. But the guns still needed him, and so he worked, each shell lifted with effort that felt like it would break him in two. Somehow he recovered, though the cough lingered for months afterward. There were small mercies. On rare days, the enemy fire grew quiet, and the men could breathe without fear. Thomas remembered one such afternoon, when the sun broke through the clouds and melted some of the frost. He sat outside, leaning against the dugout wall, and for the first time in weeks he felt a trace of warmth. A bird flew overhead, startling in its ordinariness. It reminded him that somewhere beyond this wasteland, the world still lived. But peace never lasted long. Orders soon came to prepare for another bombardment. The target was a fortified German position across no man's land, a strong point that had held back multiple infantry assaults. Thomas and the others worked tirelessly, stacking shells, checking fuses, preparing for hours of fire. When the barrage began, the ground shook endlessly, as if the earth itself were splitting apart. Smoke choked the air, flames licked across the horizon, and the thunder of guns drowned out all thought. Thomas fired until his arms ached and his ears rang, until the world was nothing but motion and noise. When the order finally came to cease fire, he stood trembling, his body vibrating from the recoil of so many shots. He looked out over the devastated land and wondered if anything could survive such destruction. And yet he knew, when the smoke cleared, men would still rise from trenches. They would still fight, still advance, still resist. The war devoured everything, and still it demanded more. The first time Thomas heard about poison gas, it sounded like just another rumor, the kind of story soldiers traded to pass the endless hours. Men spoke of a strange yellow-green mist creeping across no man's land, of whole battalions choking and clawing at their throats, of lungs burned until men collapsed in silence. Some laughed nervously, dismissing it as exaggeration. Others swore they had seen it themselves. Thomas wanted to believe it was only talk, but deep inside he knew the war had already given birth to horrors beyond imagination. Why should gas be any different? Then one morning, in the spring thaw, the rumor became reality. The day began like so many others, damp, gray, with the smell of smoke clinging to the air. The guns were loaded, the men weary from another night of shelling. Thomas was checking fuses when he noticed a commotion along the front lines. Officers were shouting, runners racing between positions, and then the word spread like wildfire. The Germans had released gas. From where he stood, Thomas could not see it at first. The battlefield was always hazy, filled with smoke and dust. But soon, a strange yellowish cloud drifted low across the ground, rolling like fog yet carrying an unnatural weight. It moved with the wind, slow but unstoppable, seeping into shell holes, crawling over barbed wire. The infantry trenches ahead erupted in chaos. Men scrambled for their masks, those crude contraptions of cloth soaked in chemicals, pressed desperately against faces. Some had none at all. Thomas watched figures stumbling, clutching their throats, their bodies convulsing as the cloud swallowed them. The order came swiftly. Artillery was to fire into the gas cloud, break up the German attack, scatter the enemy before they could exploit the terror. Thomas snapped into motion, grabbing shells, his hands trembling more than usual. They fired blind, through the haze, the roar of their guns almost drowned by the screams carried on the wind. The sound of men choking was unlike anything Thomas had ever heard. Wet, ragged, inhuman. It would stay with him long after the day ended. Gas changed everything. The war had already been cruel, but this was different. Shells killed quickly, bullets tore through flesh, but gas lingered, crept into dugouts, clung to clothing, sank into the very earth. Even when the attack ended, the smell remained. Sharp, acrid, burning the back of the throat. For days afterward, Thomas swore he could taste it on the air, like invisible poison still lurking around them. Masks were issued in greater numbers after that, though they were crude and uncomfortable. The earliest ones were little more than pads of cotton soaked in chemicals, tied over the mouth with string. Later, heavier masks with awkward goggles arrived, their rubber reeking, their straps biting into skin. Breathing through them was a struggle, each breath hot and shallow. But the men wore them whenever gas was suspected, for the alternative was unthinkable. The psychological toll was heavy. Every strange mist, every morning fog, every drifting smoke made the men nervous. They slept with masks close at hand, waking at the slightest sound, ready to strap them on. Thomas found himself dreaming of suffocation, waking with a gasp, clutching his throat as if the gas had seeped into his sleep. Even in moments of quiet, he felt his lungs ache with the memory of those who had suffocated before his eyes. Yet the war did not pause. The guns still fired, barrages still shook the ground, orders still came without mercy. The men had little time to dwell on fear, because survival left no space for reflection. They worked, they loaded, they fired, and when the gas came again, as it inevitably did, they endured it as best they could. There was one night Thomas would never forget. A creeping fog rolled in from the fields, and the men immediately panicked, certain it was gas. Masks were strapped on in the dark, hands fumbling, hearts pounding. They crouched in silence, listening, waiting. Hours passed, and nothing came, only natural mist settling over the earth. When morning broke, the men removed their masks, laughing nervously, but Thomas could see the truth in their eyes. They had all been moments away from despair. Even the mist had become an enemy. Between barrages, stories of gas spread. Some told of men who survived but were left blind, their eyes burned beyond healing. Others described lungs permanently scarred, coughing blood for the rest of their lives. The worst were those who lingered, dying slowly as each breath became agony. Thomas realized then that death was not the only thing to fear in war. Sometimes survival came with a heavier cost. One evening, as the battery cleaned their guns, Thomas overheard two older soldiers speaking. One said the world would never be the same after this war, that men had learned to poison the very air, and nothing could undo that knowledge. The other only nodded, silent, staring at the ground. For Thomas, that thought haunted him. He wondered if people at home understood what the war had become. Letters from his mother still arrived, filled with words of hope, prayers for his safety, and news of neighbors. She wrote of harvests, of church services, of the seasons turning as they always had. He could never bring himself to tell her about the gas, about the way it clawed at men's lungs. Some truths, he thought, were too heavy to send home. The guns of the battery became almost a refuge in those days. As terrible as they were, as deafening and destructive, they gave Thomas a sense of control. When he loaded a shell, when he slammed it into place and pulled the lanyard, he knew what would happen. The shell would fly, the gun would recoil, the cycle would continue. It was predictable in a war that had otherwise descended into madness. And yet, even as he clung to that routine, Thomas could not escape the memory of that drifting yellow cloud. It was a reminder that the war was evolving, that each day seemed to invent new ways of breaking men. The artillery could level fortresses, but even the heaviest gun could not stop the air itself from turning against them. As the days turned into weeks, he wondered what would come next. The spring offensive came with little warning, though in truth, Thomas and the others had been expecting it for weeks. The rumble of movement along the front had grown steadily. Endless convoys of ammunition wagons, columns of infantry marching past, supply trains unloading more material than Thomas could have imagined possible. The sheer buildup was almost frightening. The men knew that when so much steel and flesh gathered in one place, the storm that followed would be unlike anything they had yet endured. Orders came down that their battery would be part of the preliminary bombardment. They were to hammer the enemy positions for days on end, softening trenches, destroying wire, collapsing dugouts. The plan, the officers explained, was to overwhelm the Germans with such relentless fire that nothing could survive. Then the infantry would advance, and the war might finally break free from its deadlock. When the bombardment began, Thomas thought the earth itself might collapse. Their guns fired day and night, without pause, without mercy. The ground shook constantly, the very air seemed to quiver, and the sky glowed at night with the flash of thousands of guns stretching along the horizon. It was as if a thunderstorm had descended to the earth and decided never to leave. For Thomas, the work blurred into a single endless rhythm. He lifted shells, slammed them into the breach, pulled the cord, and felt the gun recoil against the ground. Again and again without end. His muscles burned, his ears rang, his throat ached from shouting over the roar. Sleep became a distant memory. They grabbed minutes of rest when they could, lying in the mud, trembling from the concussions of nearby guns even as they drifted into exhausted dreams. The sheer scale of the bombardment was impossible to comprehend. They fired more shells in a single day than Thomas had thought existed when he first joined the army. Crates arrived constantly, carried by wagons and sweating horses, stacked high beside the guns. Shells of every type, high explosive, shrapnel, gas, piled up like mountains. Men's backs bent under the weight of carrying them, but still the flow never stopped. After 3 days, Thomas noticed something strange. The men no longer reacted to the sound of firing. Where once the crash of their own guns or the whine of incoming shells had drawn shouts or curses, now they barely flinched. The noise was constant, unending, so overwhelming that their senses seemed to shut down. They worked like machines, eyes glazed, hands blackened with powder, bodies moving as if separate from their minds. The infantry, too, were caught in the storm. Runners arrived with reports of men crouching in trenches, unable to hear commands, unable to think through the barrage. The earth shook so violently that some believed it would swallow them whole. Rumors spread that even the Germans had gone mad under the pounding, their dugouts collapsing, their wounded crying out in tunnels too deep to be reached. And yet, amidst all this destruction, Thomas began to sense the fragility of it all. For every gun they fired, the Germans had one of their own. For every barrage launched, a counter-barrage answered. Their own lines were shelled, dugouts collapsed, horses killed in the mud. Men died in the rear just as they died at the front. The war was not simply advancing. It was devouring both sides equally, grinding them down without end. Exhaustion soon became their greatest enemy. Thomas felt it seep into his very bones, heavier than the shells he carried. He moved through each day in a haze, unable to remember where one ended and the next began. Meals were swallowed without tasting, conversations passed without notice. His hands developed deep cuts and blisters from handling shells, and yet he barely felt the pain. The body simply carried on because it had no other choice. But the mind was harder to numb. At night, when he finally collapsed on the damp floor of the dugout, his thoughts churned. He dreamed of endless firing, of guns that roared forever, of hands that bled without ceasing. Sometimes he dreamed of silence, but it was never a peaceful silence. It was a silence filled with absence, with the knowledge that something terrible had already happened. He would wake gasping, his heart racing, and then he would return to the guns again. There was one evening, after a particularly brutal day, when Thomas sat beside the gun and stared at the horizon. The bombardment had not ceased, but for a moment he allowed his mind to wander. He thought of his father, who had fought in another war years ago. One fought with rifles and bayonets, but not with machines like these. He wondered if his father could have imagined this. The earth itself torn open by steel, the sky lit with fire for days on end. Would he even recognize this as war? Or would he see it as something entirely new, something darker? Among the men, talk grew grim. Some believed the offensive would succeed, that the Germans would finally be broken. Others whispered that no amount of shelling could truly clear the enemy trenches, that when the infantry advanced, they would still face machine guns waiting. Thomas kept his thoughts to himself, though doubt gnawed at him. He had seen too much to believe in easy victories. When the order came for the infantry to go over the top, the guns roared even louder, covering their advance. Thomas and the others worked furiously, their hands slick with sweat despite the chill air. They knew that every shell fired was meant to shield the men now climbing ladders and charging across no man's land. And then came the waiting. They kept firing, kept hammering, but all the while Thomas could not stop thinking about the men out there in the storm. He pictured them stumbling over craters, barbed wire, and bodies, pushing forward into a wasteland that had once been countryside. He imagined the machine guns waiting, the counterfire, the gas. He wondered how many of those men would still be alive when morning came. The barrage went on, the earth shaking beneath their boots, and Thomas realized something terrible. He no longer knew what silence sounded like. The night after the offensive was one Thomas would never forget, though it began quietly enough. The guns finally fell silent, leaving only the distant creaking of damaged trees and the faint murmur of surviving men wandering the fields. For hours, Thomas sat in the mud outside the dugout, staring at the horizon, expecting some sign of victory, some hint that all their labor, sweat, and fear had mattered. When morning came, it was not triumph that greeted him, but devastation. The landscape was almost unrecognizable. Craters scarred the earth like open wounds, and what had once been villages were now splintered ruins. Wooden homes were twisted into shapes that no longer resembled shelter. Roofs caved, chimneys toppled. Horses and livestock lay where they had fallen, frozen in unnatural poses. Smoke still rose from some distant corners, and the wind carried the acrid tang of fire and death. Thomas and the men were told to survey the results. They trudged across mud and shell holes, their boots sinking into waterlogged earth, eyes scanning for survivors. The infantry had advanced, yes, but the gains were minimal. Trenches were still occupied by German soldiers. Many dugouts had held despite hours of bombardment, and the fields remained a graveyard for thousands. They had fired so many shells that the very soil seemed pulverized. Yet the enemy endured. He felt a strange, hollow pride mixed with crushing despair. They had done their duty, followed every order, yet the war seemed unaffected. Each shell had been aimed, loaded, and fired with precision, yet the battlefield mocked them, as though to say that no human effort could alter its cruel designs. Thomas wondered if there was ever a moment in this war where one could feel truly victorious, or if the concept of victory had long ago been drowned beneath the endless roar of guns. Among the men, voices were quiet, almost hesitant. Some cursed, some stared blankly, others tried to laugh but failed. One soldier muttered that it felt like they had fought a giant only to discover it was immortal. Thomas could not argue with that. The ground itself seemed alive with memory, of those who had fallen, of those who had fired, of all the violence that had passed through it. Letters came slowly after the offensive. For Thomas, each one was a fragile lifeline, a reminder of home. But even the words of hope and love felt faint, distant, almost unreal in the face of what he had seen. He wrote back when he could, carefully choosing phrases that would not alarm his family, never mentioning the dead, the devastation, or the horrors of the gas. Words on paper seemed powerless here, unable to reach across the ruin and fear that now filled his life. The mental strain became almost unbearable. Nights brought nightmares that blurred with memory. The screams of the wounded, the recoil of guns that never seemed to stop, the hiss of poison gas rolling across the fields. Thomas would wake shivering, clutching at blankets that offered no warmth, trying to catch his breath as though the very air had turned against him. Even in the day, there was no relief. The soldiers were expected to maintain their positions, to keep the guns ready, to watch for counterattacks. The Germans had begun shelling their own damaged positions, a desperate attempt to slow any further advance. Thomas could hear the impacts in the distance, the earth shivering again beneath him, and he realized that no pause, no lull was truly safe. Amid this chaos, small moments of humanity emerged, fleeting and fragile. A man shared half his meager rations with Thomas when he noticed his hands shaking from hunger and cold. Another offered a cigarette, pressed to Thomas's lips in silent solidarity. These gestures seemed insignificant against the vast machinery of war, yet they were the only proof that life persisted amidst destruction. Thomas also began noticing the absurdity of some routines, the way the human mind seeks structure even in total chaos. They polished guns obsessively, counted shells, checked fuses again and again. It was almost ritualistic. In moments of exhaustion, some men hummed or sang quietly under their breath, songs from home that had long since lost any melody in the din of artillery. Thomas found comfort in these sounds, small threads connecting him to a world that still existed outside the war. But even as they tried to hold on to normalcy, the dead were everywhere. Bodies left in craters, limbs sticking at odd angles, faces frozen in terror, mud and blood caked over uniforms. Thomas could not avoid seeing them. The more he witnessed, the more he understood that the cost of every shell, every round, every day spent at the guns was measured not just in territory gained or lost, but in lives destroyed. Rumors spread through the battery about what had happened in other sectors, tales so horrific that men could barely speak of them. Entire battalions were said to have vanished in a single barrage, swallowed by earth, mud, and fire. Officers spoke in cautious tones, avoiding specifics, yet the implication was clear. Survival was arbitrary, and luck mattered more than skill or courage. And yet, Thomas carried on. The guns remained, the earth shook, and the war continued. There was no time to mourn, no time to fully comprehend the scale of loss. Each day demanded attention, each shell demanded action. To stop was to surrender to the chaos. One evening, Thomas sat in the fading light, staring across the devastated land. He wondered how long this would go on, if the war would ever end, and whether he would remember anything of life beyond the guns. He realized, with a mixture of dread and resignation, that he had changed. The war had carved him as surely as it had carved the landscape, leaving hollows in places where innocence, hope, and youth once lived. And in that moment, as the sky darkened, Thomas knew that the world had become something new, something brutal, unyielding, and forever marked by thunder, fire, and the endless echo of artillery. Night warfare brought an entirely different kind of terror. Thomas had experienced the roar of guns, the deafening thunder of shells, the choking pall of gas, but darkness had a subtle, insidious cruelty all its own. Shadows became distorted, familiar shapes twisted into threats, and the silence between bursts of artillery carried a weight heavier than noise. The first night raid Thomas witnessed began without warning. He had just finished checking the breech of his gun when a runner arrived, panting, his uniform smeared with mud. "Trench raid," he gasped. "Enemies coming. Prepare." There was no time to question, no time to process. Orders were shouted, Men scrambled into position, rifles readied, bayonets checked, and for a moment, the world shrank to the narrow confines of their trench. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum. At first, Thomas could hear nothing but the wind through shattered trees and the distant rumble of artillery still firing elsewhere along the front. Then came the sounds that made the hair on his neck stand up. Soft, almost inaudible shuffles, the scraping of boots against dirt, whispers carried on the breeze. The Germans moved like shadows, slipping between craters, scaling mounds of broken earth, seeking gaps in the defenses. The raid was swift and merciless. Men in the battery fired blindly, aiming at noises, shapes, anything that might signal movement. Thomas braced himself behind the gun as bullets zipped over the mud, thudding into sandbags, snapping splinters into the air. He could see the flashes of rifles, hear the brief crack of gunfire, then silence again, broken only by the screams of those caught in the enemy's grip. One soldier next to him was cut down before Thomas could even react, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to tilt. The raiders vanished as quickly as they appeared, melting back into darkness. Thomas and the others ran along the trenches, checking corners, prodding at shadowy recesses where the enemy might be hiding. Bodies were dragged out, men were tended to if they survived, and the wounded groaned in mud that smelled of blood, smoke, and decay. The raid had lasted mere minutes, yet it felt eternal. Thomas understood then that night brought a new kind of helplessness. During the day, artillery could protect the infantry, break enemy lines, reshape the battlefield. At night, they were blind, vulnerable, forced to rely on instinct, luck, and the faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through smoke. Each shadow could hide a rifle, a bayonet, or a man's final strike. Sleep itself became a rare commodity, for no one could rest knowing the darkness held enemies both seen and unseen. Some nights, the raids were so frequent that Thomas barely had time to clean the guns, eat, or rest. Exhaustion pressed down like a physical weight, dulling reflexes and clouding judgment. Men began to speak of hallucinations, glimpses of shapes that weren't there, whispers in the mud that carried no source, footsteps that repeated when no one moved. Thomas tried to dismiss these as stress, as fatigue, as the mind's desperate attempt to process endless fear. But deep down, he could not be sure. And yet, amidst the terror, small glimpses of resilience appeared. Soldiers would share whispered warnings, pass along rations in secret, pull each other from mud, cover each other's flanks. There was camaraderie in surviving the impossible, a bond forged in shared fear and endurance. Thomas found strange comfort in it, knowing that in these brief moments, they were not alone. The raids also brought a new kind of strategic thinking. Thomas noticed that the enemy often targeted weak points, testing lines for days before striking decisively. Observation became crucial. Men watched the shadows, counted sounds, studied patterns, and tried to predict where the next raid would come from. The war, he realized, was not only fought with shells and rifles. It was fought in perception, in awareness, in the ability to anticipate the unseen. Sleep deprivation, however, made such vigilance almost unbearable. Thomas would doze for minutes at a time, only to be jerked awake by the smallest sound. Sometimes he woke to the sensation of hands on him, only to find it was another soldier, trembling in fear. Sometimes he awoke to shadows moving across the trench, convinced they were Germans, only to discover a piece of debris swaying in the wind. The line between reality and imagination blurred, and every decision carried consequences he could not afford to misjudge. Amid this, the psychological toll deepened. Thomas began noticing that men reacted differently under continuous stress. Some became reckless, lashing out or taking unnecessary risks. Others withdrew, staring blankly at nothing, murmuring names of home or loved ones. And some laughed. A hollow, nervous laughter that rose unexpectedly, echoing in the dark. All of it was a sign of survival, Thomas thought, even if it appeared as madness to the outside eye. One night, Thomas's unit was hit by a combination of artillery fire and a trench raid. The noise, confusion, and fear combined into something he could barely comprehend. He felt mud caked on his face, a wet sleeve stuck to his cheek, and the weight of exhaustion pressing on him like lead. The men screamed, shouted orders, ducked, and fired, all in a chaotic symphony of survival. By the time dawn arrived, Thomas realized he had not eaten, had not slept, had not truly moved with conscious thought for nearly 18 hours. When the first light of day finally crept over the horizon, it revealed the aftermath. Bodies scattered, trenches partially collapsed, blood frozen in patches of frost. The enemy had retreated, leaving only destruction behind. Thomas sat against the wall of a dugout, breathing heavily, feeling a strange mix of relief and emptiness. He realized that no matter how well they survived, the war's imprint on him, and on all of them, would last far longer than the battle itself. Yet life at the guns continued. Orders came to reestablish positions, to repair what had been damaged, to continue firing when needed. The raids had shown the fragility of safety, but they had not broken the men. They carried on because survival demanded it, because the world outside the trench held no mercy. And Thomas, weary, muddy, and haunted, knew that every shadow, every noise, every night could hold the same terror again. The days after the night raids were strangely quiet, a deceptive lull that did little to ease the tension in the battery. Thomas and the others moved like ghosts through the trenches, their movements mechanical, their eyes scanning constantly. Even in moments of stillness, the memory of shadows and sudden gunfire clung to them, refusing to be shaken off. The war, Thomas realized, was not just fought in the open but also in the mind, and the battle inside the skull could be far crueler than anything outside. Stories began to circulate among the men, tales born of fear, exaggeration, and the desperate need for understanding. One soldier swore he had seen a shell explode in midair and reform into a man, who then walked off the battlefield, unharmed and laughing. Another told of a ghostly soldier wandering the front, appearing wherever death was imminent, whispering warnings or curses. Thomas listened to these tales in silence, half believing, half dismissing them, yet he couldn't deny the comfort they offered. For a moment, the horror of reality could be replaced with something narrative, something that could be named and discussed. Amid these stories, the battery developed small rituals to keep themselves sane. One man carried a lucky coin, pressing it into his palm before every shot. Another would whisper the name of a loved one before pulling the lanyard. They joked about superstitions, sometimes bitterly, sometimes with genuine belief. Thomas found himself participating, touching a particular shell or muttering a small phrase under his breath, as if that tiny action could shield him from the unseen. The psychological strain of continuous shelling was worse than anything Thomas had imagined. Days bled into nights with no real distinction. Sleep was fitful and broken. Dreams were filled with explosions, screaming men, and the endless recoil of the guns. Even in waking hours, the constant thunder left his ears ringing, his head pounding, and his thoughts scattered. He sometimes caught himself staring at nothing, lost in a haze of exhaustion and fear, and realized he had forgotten the last hour or two entirely. Letters from home arrived sporadically, but even those could not pierce the fog of his mind. He read them, trying to summon the warmth of memory, the familiarity of family and village life. But the words seemed distant, abstract, like they belonged to someone else's world. He could recall what a candlelit kitchen looked like, the smell of bread baking in an oven, the sound of church bells on Sunday. But these images felt fragile, vulnerable to the relentless bombardment of reality surrounding him. Thomas began noticing the small ways the mind coped. Men would hum old songs under their breath, repeat jokes they had long forgotten, or invent elaborate stories to fill the silence. One afternoon, a soldier told a tale of a massive rabbit that had supposedly survived the shelling of an entire sector, hopping from crater to crater, laughing at the destruction. Others would add to the story, embellishing the size, the antics, even giving the rabbit a family of survivors. Laughter, small, fleeting, nervous, broke through the endless tension, and for a moment, the men were no longer merely survivors. They were storytellers, creating an alternate reality to survive the one that engulfed them. Yet, even these small comforts could not fully mask the trauma. The mental toll was visible in subtle ways. Trembling hands that no amount of work could steady, vacant stares at the horizon, bursts of anger or frustration at imagined slights. Thomas saw it in himself, though he tried to ignore it. He felt a constant tension in his chest, a weight pressing down that no rest or meal could ease. He noticed that some men had begun carrying small tokens, scraps of cloth, bits of wood, photographs, pressing them to their chests when fear threatened to overwhelm them. Among the older soldiers, there were whispered discussions of the myths surrounding artillerymen. They spoke of a ghost battery that supposedly fired without men, appearing only in moments of extreme danger, turning the tide of battle in inexplicable ways. Some believed that every gun had a spirit, a consciousness that protected or punished based on the hearts of those who fired it. Thomas listened silently, intrigued despite himself. Perhaps, he thought, these stories were less about superstition and more about giving shape to the unshapeable. The chaos, the fear, the relentless destruction that surrounded them. The men also shared personal legends. Tales of comrades who had survived impossible wounds, who had wandered for days through no man's land only to return unharmed. Stories of soldiers who had predicted raids, dodged shells, or found shelter at the exact right moment. The line between truth and fiction blurred, but the purpose was clear. These stories kept hope alive. They reminded men that survival was not only possible but sometimes miraculous, even in the heart of a war designed to strip them of everything. Thomas found himself reflecting more on the absurdities and contradictions of life at the front. The same guns that could destroy entire villages could also protect them. The same mud that immobilized could offer cover. The same shadows that terrified could hide brief moments of quiet. The duality of existence, the constant balance between death and survival, was almost impossible to grasp. Yet it became the only reality they knew. Amid all this, Thomas discovered something else. A sense of identity tied not just to survival, but to the act of remembering. Recording small details, observing patterns, noting what stories circulated. These became exercises of control in a world that offered none. He began to keep a private journal, scribbling observations, rumors, and tales alongside mundane notes of gun maintenance or supply counts. It was not hope exactly, but it was something. A thread linking him to the self he had been before the war, a fragile tether to sanity. And so, the days continued. The guns fired, the men survived, the stories grew. Each night brought terror, each morning revealed devastation, and each fleeting moment of humor, camaraderie, or myth reminded Thomas that even in the most relentless machinery of destruction, humans found ways to endure. The counterattack arrived on a gray, rain-soaked morning. Thomas and the others had spent the previous night repairing damaged guns, checking ammunition, and trying vainly to rest in the mud-filled dugouts. The wind was cold, slicing through their uniforms, and the ground squelched underfoot, soaked with days of relentless rain. At first, there was a tense quiet, the kind that precedes disaster, the sort of silence that makes every snap of a twig or distant crack of artillery feel like the herald of doom. Then it began. At first, small bursts of gunfire, distant but rapidly approaching, punctuated by the dull, steady thuds of artillery from the German lines. The battery immediately sprang into action. Thomas grabbed shells, his hands slick with mud and sweat, heart pounding. The first salvo of the counterattack landed near their position, shattering sandbags, sending mud and fragments flying, and toppling a makeshift storage platform. The roar of the guns was deafening, yet it seemed almost muted beneath the sense of impending catastrophe. The Germans were pushing hard, and this attack was unlike anything Thomas had experienced before. It was coordinated, deliberate, and merciless. Infantry surged across the shattered no-man's land, shielded by a storm of artillery and machine gun fire. Their approach was calculated, testing defenses, probing weak points, and then striking with terrifying precision. Thomas watched, feeling both awe and dread at the sheer organization behind the chaos. The battery fought desperately to hold its position. Guns fired continuously, shells thudding into the advancing enemy. The mud sucked at Thomas's boots, slowing his movements, but he did not stop. He had learned long ago that hesitation could be fatal. Each shell loaded and fired was an act of survival, a defiance against the overwhelming force bearing down upon them. Yet even as he worked, he could see comrades fall. Some hit instantly, others crushed or buried by the collapsing earth from nearby explosions. In the middle of this storm, Thomas noticed the psychological toll in full. Men shouted at one another, sometimes in anger, sometimes in panic. Some froze entirely, staring at the approaching figures as if mesmerized. Others moved with mechanical efficiency, hands and eyes performing tasks they no longer thought about. Thomas felt his own mind teetering, the hours of exhaustion and fear pressing down. Yet he forced himself to continue, driven by the instinct to survive and protect those around him. The counterattack brought a mix of weaponry Thomas had rarely seen deployed so effectively. Gas, previously used sporadically, was now released in tandem with the infantry's advance, rolling like a living thing across the battlefield. The stench of chemicals mixed with the wet earth, the acrid smoke of explosives, and the metallic tang of blood. Masks were pressed to faces, but some men, unprepared or caught off guard, coughed and choked, their panic creating chaos in the tightly packed battery lines. Amid the relentless bombardment, Thomas began to perceive the subtle strategies the enemy used. They fired shells that aimed to collapse trenches, force men into the open, or distract from flanking maneuvers. Their movements were synchronized with artillery bursts, so that every moment of confusion was exploited. Thomas marveled at the efficiency, horrified by the precision, and felt the enormity of the task they faced. Survival was no longer simply about staying alive. It was about understanding the mind of the enemy, anticipating and reacting faster than instinct. The casualties mounted. Thomas watched men he had shared meals, jokes, and brief moments of respite with fall to the ground. Some cried out, some whispered prayers, some did not make a sound at all. Every loss seemed magnified in the chaotic, compressed reality of battle. There was no time for mourning, only the constant imperative to act. Yet each death cut deeper than the last, a reminder that survival was arbitrary, that bravery did not guarantee endurance, and that the line between life and oblivion was thinner than he had ever imagined. Hours stretched on, with the counterattack relentless. The ground shook under shellfire, mud became a sticky trap, and water pooled in trenches, making movement both exhausting and treacherous. The battery fired continuously, but shells were not infinite, and soon they began rationing, choosing targets with grim calculation. Thomas noticed that men's reactions became sharper, more instinctive, a strange efficiency born of fear and necessity. Yet it was also wearying, the body and mind beginning to fail under the unending pressure. Thomas began to understand the true cost of endurance. Courage, he realized, was not the absence of fear but the capacity to act despite it. Yet even courage could not erase exhaustion, grief, or the creeping sense of futility. The counterattack demonstrated that survival was temporary, fragile, and sometimes meaningless in the face of overwhelming forces. Each day, each hour, each shell fired was both a triumph and a reminder of vulnerability. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the Germans began to withdraw. The battery had held, though at a devastating cost. Trenches were collapsed, men were dead or wounded, and much of their position was ruined. Yet somehow, Thomas and the remaining soldiers had survived. They were battered, bleeding, exhausted, and haunted, but alive. As the adrenaline faded, reality returned. Thomas sat in the mud, shell-shocked and numb, staring at the shattered battlefield. He realized that the war's lessons were not in victory or defeat, but in endurance. Survival was not heroic. It was necessary. The human mind and body could adapt, could endure, could find small victories in the smallest actions. Loading a shell, moving a comrade, holding a position for a few hours longer than expected. In the silence that followed, broken only by distant artillery and groans from the wounded, Thomas allowed himself a rare thought. He wondered if he would remember all of this when the war ended, if he would recall the details of mud, smoke, and fear, or if it would blur into an endless nightmare, a shadowed memory that refused to form clearly. He realized that memory itself was a survival mechanism, as selective as the body's endurance. Yet amidst the exhaustion and loss, a fragile sense of resolve remained. Thomas knew that the battery would continue, that tomorrow would bring another barrage, another raid, another day filled with fire and mud. Survival was all that mattered, and for now they had survived. The days after the counterattack were strangely hollow, a vacuum in which the body continued to move even when the mind struggled to keep pace. Thomas found himself performing tasks almost automatically. Checking the guns, stacking shells, relaying orders. Every movement had become a part of an unbroken routine, necessary for survival, but stripped of conscious thought. It was as though the war had rewritten the rules of existence, where instinct replaced decision and fear replaced reflection. Men spoke less now, and when they did, it was in short, clipped sentences. Conversations were limited to essentials. How many shells left? Is the trench secure? Is anyone wounded? Words that once carried humor, camaraderie, or comfort had been replaced by efficiency. Even laughter, when it occurred, was brittle and forced, a fleeting attempt to reclaim humanity from the mud and smoke. Yet, in the darkest moments, camaraderie remained. It emerged in small gestures, sharing a meager ration, lending a cigarette, covering a comrade with a blanket while the mud froze around him. Thomas found that these acts, though minor, held immense significance. They were threads of human connection, fragile yet defiant, asserting that even amidst the unrelenting horror, life persisted. Sleep, however, became increasingly elusive. The body craved it, but the mind resisted, haunted by memory and expectation. Thomas would drift briefly into unconsciousness, only to be jarred awake by a nightmare or the thud of a distant shell. Sometimes, he woke with his hands clutching the mud, his heart racing, sweat cold on his skin. Other times, he would awaken beside a fallen comrade, frozen in the night, and feel a sudden, terrifying awareness of mortality. Each night blurred into the next, creating a sense of temporal dislocation. The psychological effects were not uniform. Some men hardened, their nerves steel-like, seemingly unaffected by horror. Others began to fracture, trembling at shadows, jumping at sudden noises, or withdrawing into silence. Thomas observed all of this, noting patterns, recording details in his mind as if cataloging the human response to war. He noticed that humor often appeared alongside despair. Dark, absurd jokes that acknowledged death without fear. One soldier recounted a tale of a sniper who allegedly mistook a scarecrow for an enemy officer, and the men laughed, briefly, even as Thomas realized the story might be true or fabricated. Thomas also observed the subtle ways men adapted to constant danger. They memorized patterns of shelling, anticipating bursts of fire. They learned to move in the shadows, to recognize the faintest disturbance in mud or grass that signaled approaching danger. They developed rituals, crossing themselves before loading a shell, tapping a lucky coin against the barrel, whispering names of loved ones. These acts were neither purely superstition nor purely strategy. They were a psychological armor, an attempt to impose order on chaos. Amid the exhaustion, Thomas found moments of reflection. He thought of the world beyond the trenches, of fields and rivers untouched by fire, of towns that still smelled of bread and wood smoke. He imagined a life that once existed, and he wondered whether he would remember it clearly when this war ended, or if it would fade into an unreachable dream. The contrast between memory and present reality was stark, almost unbearable. Letters from home, when they arrived, became both a comfort and a burden. They reminded Thomas of life outside, yet also of what he had lost, what could be lost, and what might never return. He read them carefully, savoring each word, yet wary of allowing hope to grow too fully. Hope, he knew, could be as dangerous as despair. It could leave one unprepared for the relentless cruelty of the battlefield. Even in these moments, Thomas noticed the interplay between fear and courage. Survival demanded more than physical endurance. It required a constant negotiation with fear. Men acted despite terror, performed duties with exhaustion pressing on their bones, and faced death daily without certainty. Courage was no longer an abstract concept. It was a living, breathing necessity, an instinct intertwined with the basic human drive to endure. Stories and rumors continued to circulate, blending reality and myth. Soldiers told tales of comrades returning from no man's land unscathed by miraculous circumstances. They spoke of ghost batteries that fired without operators, of shells that seemed to avoid certain men, of visions that warned of imminent danger. Thomas neither fully believed nor dismissed these stories. He realized that myths had a purpose. They allowed men to assign meaning to events that otherwise appeared random, to assert control over an uncontrollable world. The psychological strain deepened, however, with each passing day. Thomas noticed subtle changes in himself. Moments of disorientation, a dulling of sensation, the blurring of past and present. He sometimes paused mid-task, unsure if he had moved or thought before. He noticed that memories of home were tinged with melancholy, almost as if filtered through the lens of what he had endured. The war had altered perception, reshaping not just the body but the very framework of consciousness. Amid all this, Thomas discovered small pockets of hope, often in the most unlikely places. A shared joke in the mess, a fleeting glance of sunlight over the trench, the survival of a comrade despite impossible odds. All of these became milestones, reminders that humanity persisted even in a world dominated by destruction. Each instance was fragile, ephemeral, yet powerful enough to anchor him against the tide of despair. And so, Thomas continued, navigating a world that demanded constant vigilance, endurance, and the ability to find meaning in the smallest of acts. The guns fired, the earth shook, and the men survived, clinging to the thin threads of life, memory, and camaraderie that connected them to something beyond the mud and smoke. In this relentless environment, survival was not merely physical. It was an ongoing negotiation with fear, with hope, and with the stories that gave shape to an otherwise incomprehensible reality. The war was not confined to the trenches, the guns, or the battlefield itself. One morning, Thomas and a small group of soldiers were ordered to venture beyond their lines to inspect a nearby village rumored to have been abandoned during the shelling. The journey through the mud-slick fields was slow and treacherous, each step a negotiation with the terrain. Every crater, every collapsed fence, every broken tree reminded Thomas that the destruction of the front extended far beyond the immediate conflict. When they arrived, the village was eerily silent. Smoke rose in thin, intermittent wisps from what remained of chimneys, and the air carried the combined smell of soot, rot, and the faint sweetness of overripe fruit left in orchards. Houses were shattered, windows blown out, doors hanging on broken hinges. Walls were pockmarked with shrapnel, and the streets were littered with debris, splintered wood, and the remnants of what had once been everyday life. Thomas noticed the absence of people first. There were no children running, no women tending to fires or fetching water, no men repairing roofs or digging in gardens. The silence was almost physical, pressing in around him, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional cry of a bird. He felt a hollow ache as he imagined what had happened to the villagers, whether they had fled, been captured, or worse. Inside the remnants of one home, Thomas and his comrades found evidence of sudden departure. Plates lay scattered on the floor, a kettle still half full on the stove, clothing abandoned as if the residence had been pulled away abruptly. A child's shoe rested near the doorway, mud-streaked and small, a stark reminder of the lives disrupted or ended by a conflict that seemed to consume everything indiscriminately. Thomas pressed his hand against the cold wall, imagining the people who had lived there, their routines, their joys, their fears, now vanished or scattered. Despite the desolation, life persisted in small, almost imperceptible ways. A cat slunk between the rubble, cautious and watchful, its fur matted with soot. A dog, collar still intact, prowled the streets, sniffing for something, perhaps its absent owner, perhaps food. Wildflowers sprouted in shattered gardens, resilient against the overwhelming odds, offering a quiet counterpoint to the devastation. Thomas felt a strange mix of sorrow and awe. Life clung stubbornly, even amidst the ruins. The soldiers explored cautiously, aware that the village might still be under threat or hiding enemy combatants. In one cellar, Thomas found remnants of a family's possessions: books, a cracked porcelain doll, and a small wooden chest filled with coins and trinkets. He ran his fingers over the objects, imagining the stories they carried. These items, so mundane yet so personal, contrasted starkly with the impersonal violence that had reduced the village to rubble. They were reminders that war was not only about soldiers and battles, but also about the everyday lives it erased. As they moved through the streets, Thomas overheard whispers among his comrades. Some speculated about what the villagers were doing now, whether they had survived, whether they would return. Others spoke of the absurdity of destroying places where innocent lives had existed, questioning the purpose and morality of their orders. Thomas remained silent, absorbing the weight of what he saw. It was one thing to fire a gun, to withstand shelling, to endure fear. It was another entirely to witness the consequences of that violence on ordinary people, to feel the moral and emotional residue that lingered long after the battle. In the town square, they found a church partially collapsed, its steeple broken and leaning precariously. Inside, sunlight filtered through shattered stained glass, casting fragmented colors on the stone floor. Thomas knelt for a moment, running his hands over the pews, imagining the prayers that had once been offered there, the weddings, baptisms, and funerals that had marked the passage of life. The building had survived partially, but it bore the scars of war, a silent testament to both resilience and destruction. The soldiers continued their inspection, marking damaged structures and noting potential hazards. Thomas observed how the war had rewritten the landscape itself, how nature and civilization had been reshaped by relentless artillery, trench digging, and the movement of troops. Even small roads, once orderly and predictable, had become treacherous, dotted with craters, debris, and hidden pitfalls. Survival, he realized, extended beyond the battlefield. It now included navigating a world permanently altered by conflict. During a brief pause, Thomas reflected on the human stories behind the ruins. Each broken house had once held a family, each abandoned street a memory, each destroyed orchard a source of sustenance. The war had consumed not only soldiers but also the social fabric, leaving gaps that would take years, perhaps decades, to repair. He felt a profound connection to those lives, a sense of shared vulnerability, even though he had never met the people of this village. As they prepared to leave, Thomas noticed a small piece of paper fluttering in the wind, partially buried in mud. It was a letter, smeared and torn, but he could make out a few words. A mother writing to a son, expressing hope that he would return safely. He held the paper carefully, feeling the weight of unfulfilled wishes and interrupted lives. It reminded him that war was not an abstract concept. It was the destruction of human stories, a relentless force that reached far beyond the front lines. Returning to the trenches, Thomas carried the images of the village with him. He realized that survival at the front was only one aspect of war. Understanding its broader consequences was another. The village, silent yet speaking volumes, was a reminder of the fragility of life and the pervasive reach of conflict. Even as artillery fired and shells exploded, Thomas knew that the war extended into every corner of human existence, reshaping the world in ways that would echo long after the guns fell silent. The day of the bombardment began with an eerie stillness. Thomas and the battery had received reports of an impending offensive, but nothing could have prepared them for the intensity that was about to unfold. The sky, gray and heavy with clouds, seemed to press down on the men, as though anticipating the chaos. Even the wind was silent, leaving an unnatural calm over the battlefield that only heightened the tension. Thomas could feel it in his bones. This would not be just another day of firing, checking, and enduring. It would be a trial of every skill, every nerve, and every ounce of willpower he possessed. The first shells fell without warning, exploding with a roar that made the earth tremble beneath them. Thomas felt the vibrations through his boots and up his spine, as if the world itself were shaking in pain. Shrapnel hissed through the air, embedding in sandbags and wood, sometimes striking men who had no chance to move. The battery was in full action instantly, men shouting, shells flying, smoke curling around them like a living creature. Every movement became urgent, every second mattered. Thomas grabbed shells with hands slick from sweat and mud, each round loaded and fired as if his life depended on it, which, in a very real sense, it did. Hours passed in a blur of sound, motion, and fear. The bombardment was relentless. Every time Thomas thought a lull might be coming, another salvo would land, ripping the earth apart and sending mud and debris flying. The trenches seemed to vanish in parts, collapsing under the pressure of repeated explosions. Men were thrown off their feet, cries of pain mingling with the deafening roar of artillery. Thomas felt his heart hammering constantly, his lungs tightening with each inhalation of smoke, dust, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Amid the chaos, Thomas noticed how the men adapted to survive. Movements became instinctual, almost choreographed. One man grabbed a shell while another held the gun steady. A third passed the spent casing along a chain that never faltered. Every action, no matter how small, became a crucial thread in a tapestry of survival. Mistakes were deadly, hesitation was unthinkable, and yet somehow, despite exhaustion and fear, the battery kept firing. Allied units arrived sporadically to reinforce their lines. Thomas found himself working alongside soldiers he had never met, men from different regions, different backgrounds, all united by the singular imperative to survive. Communication was limited, often just short commands shouted over the noise, gestures, or shared glances. Yet even in that fragmented interaction, Thomas sensed a deeper bond. The understanding that each man, regardless of origin, faced the same terror, and that cooperation was not just practical but essential. During a brief lull, Thomas had a moment to observe the battlefield. Craters pockmarked the earth like open wounds, the mud churned and blackened by explosions, and scattered debris marked the paths of fallen soldiers. Bodies, both friend and foe, lay where they had fallen, reminders of the arbitrariness of survival. Amid this devastation, he noticed something almost imperceptible. A lone fox darting between craters, seemingly untouched by the violence surrounding it. It was a small, fragile reminder that life could persist, even in the most harrowing circumstances. The bombardment tested Thomas in ways beyond physical endurance. The noise alone was a constant assault on the senses, making it nearly impossible to think clearly. His ears rang continuously, his vision blurred at the edges from the smoke and dust. Each explosion sent vibrations through his chest, his head, his very being, creating a sensation of instability that was almost maddening. Yet even as fear and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, Thomas discovered a strange clarity in action. When faced with immediate danger, the mind could focus in ways that seemed impossible under normal conditions. Decision and instinct merged, creating a fragile shield against the chaos. Despite the intensity, small acts of humor and camaraderie emerged. A soldier joked about the size of a crater he had landed in, eliciting nervous laughter from the others. Another pretended to have been blown to Berlin by a shell, gesturing with dramatic flair while dusting off mud. These moments were fleeting but powerful, reminders that humanity persisted, that even amid destruction, men sought to assert life over fear. Thomas found himself smiling briefly, feeling a bond with the men that transcended words, ranks, and origins. The psychological strain, however, remained immense. Thomas noticed subtle changes in his own reactions. Brief flashes of anger, disorientation, and the sensation that time had lost its normal flow. Minutes stretched, then collapsed, and he often could not distinguish between the present and memory, between the roar of artillery and the echo of previous battles. Sleep was impossible, rest unattainable, and yet survival demanded relentless action. Every shell loaded, every command shouted, every movement through mud and chaos became a measure of willpower as much as skill. By the end of the day, when the bombardment finally eased, the battery was a shadow of itself. Exhaustion pressed down on Thomas like a physical weight, each movement requiring conscious effort. Men leaned against the walls of collapsed trenches, some silent, some muttering prayers or curses, others staring blankly at the horizon. The ground was littered with debris, spent shells, and the reminders of men who had not survived. Yet the guns still stood, and the battery had endured. Survival had come at a cost, but it was a cost they bore with quiet determination. Thomas, sitting in mud-streaked uniform, reflected on what he had witnessed. The war was an unending test of physical endurance, psychological resilience, and the human capacity for adaptation. Moments of camaraderie, humor, and small beauty, like the fox in the crater or the brief laughter of a comrade, were as vital to survival as any shell or bullet. He understood that endurance was not merely about resisting death, but about maintaining a sense of self, a connection to humanity, even when the world seemed intent on erasing both.